Hello and welcome. My name is Biagio Mazza, Pastoral Associate at St. Sabina Parish in Belton, Missouri, and I'm here to welcome you to another Do You Know series question. As we continue our series on the history of the Mass, today's Do You Know question is, do you know how the Mass evolved from Jesus' life, death, and resurrection? So it's important to remember that Jesus was a first century male Jew who had his own interpretation of the Torah, his own images and understanding of God, and he shared that understanding went about preaching and sharing that with people who would listen to him, and as a result gathered followers who became known as his disciples. From what we can tell, from through biblical and historical studies, Jesus had no intention to separate himself from Judaism, but actually was a living part of the Jewish tradition and preached in his public ministry, preached in a prophetic manner to his fellow Jews about the reign of God, and especially articulated in terms of covenant relationship with God and establishing, working towards building the reign of God on earth. So he was, in a prophetic manner, he challenged his fellow Jews to become more deeply connected to God in their covenant relationship. The table fellowship in Judaism was an extremely important ritual for the whole community because it provided fellowship, it built community, it provided bonding, and provided hospitality to one another. Jesus and his followers, unlike some Jews, practiced what we would call inclusive table fellowship. This meant that all people were welcome to their table, no matter what their religious or social status or position was all about. And so this inclusive table fellowship was at the very heart of Jesus' teaching. As a matter of fact, this is expressed very clearly in a powerful way in Luke's Gospel. Several commentators have suggested that in Luke's Gospel, Jesus is either going to, at, or coming from a meal. That's how significant the meal tradition and table fellowship was in the Jewish tradition to begin with, but most especially in Jesus' own ministry and in his disciples as they practice inclusive table fellowship. So the Last Supper, again, another meal and table fellowship, was a Passover meal in the Jewish tradition. And within that tradition, within that table relationship and fellowship, Jesus invites his followers to intimacy with him in terms of food. Jesus invites his followers to feed on him, meaning essentially to become one with him in establishing and carrying out the reign of God, namely the mission and ministry of Jesus. And this was done at a time when Jesus became aware of the fact that his stance and his values and his preaching of the reign of God had gotten him into trouble, and that this might be the last time that he might be doing table fellowship with his disciples. And he says during the meal, "Do this in memory of me." Now, it's always important to realize what is the "this" of that phrase. Well, the "this" of that phrase, yes, is sharing bread and wine and remembering Jesus and connecting with Jesus in an intimate way by feeding on him. But it also means very clearly to model ourselves on Jesus, who, even at the Last Supper, was willing to consistently be faithful to God's values, no matter what the cost. And so to do this, what Jesus was challenging his followers was to become like him in service to others, even to the point of giving one's life for others. So remember, it's important to remember that that's exactly what was happening at the Last Supper. And it's also important to remember that when Jesus was no longer with them, all of his followers were all Jews. And they continued the inclusive table fellowship that Jesus had instituted and challenged them to do. And they continued their intimacy with Jesus. And they did this essentially through the experience of inclusive table fellowship. They were all Jews. None of them were thinking about separating themselves from Judaism and so on. And as a result of that, they continued to go to the temple, and yet at the same time they would meet in fellowship meals and remember Jesus and their intimacy and communion with Jesus in and through their fellowship meals. The Last Supper, it's important to remember this as we conclude, that the Last Supper was not a Mass, but rather it was a living example of what Jesus was challenging his followers to do, namely to model their lives on him, first of all in service to others, and to welcome all to the table, to practice inclusive fellowship with all that they would come across, regardless of social, religious status or positions. So I hope this has helped to explain just a bit of how the Mass will begin to evolve out of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and I hope you will return again to more Do You Know series questions as we continue to explore the evolution of the Mass from Jesus' life, death, and resurrection into the Mass as we have come to know it today. Thank you very much.